Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. This is the opening line of Dante's Inferno, the first part of his epic poem, The Divine Comedy. Some other notable lines. The hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in times of great moral crisis, maintain their neutrality. There is no greater sorrow than to recall happiness in times of misery. Love, which quickly seizes the gentle heart, sees me with that delight which still grieves me. And finally, perhaps the most famous, abandon hope, all ye who enter here. These are some of the powerful lines from Dante Alighieri's famous poetic work, The Divine Comedy, highlighting the author's views on morality, justice, and also reflections of the emotional states throughout his life, given its many ups and downs. So join us for a discussion on the background of the poet's life, his relationships, troubles, his exile, how it colored one of the cornerstones of Western literature from the Middle Ages. This is a journey guided through the depths of hell, into purgatory, and finally emerging into paradise. And finally, how the creation of this great work was, in a way, an act of transcending personal despair by engaging with the great figures of antiquity, adopting them as spiritual ancestors of a sort, and fitting them into the Christian worldview of the author's day to create something timeless and evocative.
Welcome back to our podcast.
Yeah, Charlie and Andrei coming back at you with another banger. This one's going to be about Dante Alighieri, author of The Divine Comedy, and his personal struggles and life history and how they affected his work. It's going to be kind of an interesting deep dive into one of the most famous writers in European history. So,
Yeah, and we wanted to do something that was arguably more personal as well because we were kind of talking about Dante, his lifetime, also kind of what caused him to write this, and he was going through a period of intense depression, and we might even be considered experts in that field given personal experiences. So we
eh,
we just we find a lot of the characters that we find fascinating in literature and mythology and history in a lot of Dante's writings, especially in the Inferno. And also, it's fair to say that we've sort of been quoting the Italian to each other for years now. And so it's not only like a fascinating poem, epic poem, but it's also kind of just musically beautiful just to listen to, so to speak.
yeah, very very elaborate, very lyrical poem. And well, it's interesting. Like, well, comedy at the time didn't really mean what we think it does today in the sense of humor. It was just
Correct.
it was based on the structure and the meter of it. But I guess also just a work that would end in a happy way as opposed to a tragedy, which
Right. Like in Shakespeare's plays, the comedies are the ones basically that end happy,
yeah,
and the tragedies are one that don't end happy. And of course, you have like tragic comedies that are kind of the weird in betweens.
exactly in between. Yeah, and
And of course, that kind of probably comes from the ancient Greek experience of theater and just how those plays were, interpreted through like Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, um, and just kind of happy versus tragic ending.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
but it's I mean, we should probably start off at the beginning. Our plan is to have a recording of us kind of talking about the beginning line or reading the or reciting the beginning lines in Italian. But I mean, basically in the English, it's he's in the middle of his life's journey, which is often interpreted to be age 35, and he's kind of just walking through things. And I got my copy right here. He uh he's in a dark wood, and then he encounters this wolf, right? And there's kind of an impasse, a she wolf, and then he has to go down to hell basically to and then through the center of the earth. And then, fascinatingly from a physical perspective, like he understood that gravity would shift at the center. So when, I'm just summarizing the journey, when he passes through like that halfway point, which is like Satan's waist, like his waistline, literally, then gravity shifts and he finds a tunnel at Satan's waist and goes to the other end of the earth, which is like the antipode, which is where he comes out onto an island, presumably in the South Pacific, right? He just called it the South Seas, the Antipode, and that's the mountain of purgatory. And then if you ascend that mountain, you go up into heaven. So that's kind of the geography of Dante's cosmology. Of course, there's many layers of that in the Inferno, where he's going through the layers of hell. But I mean, presumably the idea
Hmm.
is he goes into a cave in Italy, crawls into the center of hell, and which is at the center of the earth where Satan is, and then he climbs through a tunnel into the other side, into the antipode, and comes out and that mountain was created through Satan falling down from the heavens, smashing into earth when he fell from grace. And then that, I guess, created a reverberation that created that tunnel, and that mountain is like what's the leftover. It's an interesting, like very interesting literary geography. Um,
Yeah, I mean, it's not just about the nine layers of hell. It's about like all kinds of different literary geographies, I guess.
yeah, yeah. Uh, but like we had talked about, I mean, he was going through like this massive depression, and what we would probably call like clinical depression, in his lifetime. And I mean, I think it's probably understandable. I mean, he loved Florence. He had written poetry. I mean, he was sort of like the poet of Florence. He got kicked out for political reasons. Obviously, there was the girl Beatrice that he loves, and he sees her in heaven. He sort of lost her. And I mean, he kind of just has one thing after another, bad things happening in his life. And I think he adopts kind of Virgil. I mean, I've heard others, read it, others, he sort of adopts Virgil as an ancestor, not like genetically, although I guess that's possible. But he goes into this deep reading, and he sort of propels himself out of depression and creates like this magnificent piece of art. And I mean, if he has like, I guess any advice for people in depression, it's just like you got to self-mobilize yourself. And I don't think that's like an idea that's unique to us bringing that up. And like, you can almost read that in any self-help book out there. But it's interesting I mean, Dante didn't have like Freudian psychology. He didn't have like Jungian. He didn't have like William James or anything. It's just he's just sort of reading Virgil and working through that during that time period that he's living in.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more to the backstory, honestly, though. He was born in Florence in 1265. He was part of the Guelph faction at the time, which was one of the two main factions in Florentine politics. The others being the Ghibellines. The Guelphs were pro-papacy. The Ghibellines were pro imperial, as in the Holy Roman Empire. And then he was caught up in a lot of this sort of family drama, local politics, vying for power, and things like that. And supposedly he was eventually accused of like doing something with funds and mismanaging or like shady stuff with that, and was thus exiled from Florence as a result of that. So that was one of the big blows to him that probably caused a lot of his despair, because he often spoke about being an exile, and longing for his home city. That was a major theme in his work. As you mentioned, also Beatrice Portinari, she was a married woman. He was also separately married in an arranged marriage to someone else. There probably was not a lot of love in the marriage. That was common back then, but he really felt a connection to this other woman. And when she died, he was deeply affected. And I guess he made her one of the muses in his work guiding them through, I believe it was Purgatorio, and and then so he uses like a lot of guides, right? So Virgil is his guide through the Inferno, the underworld. Then he has Beatrice, what's his name? Bernard de Clairvaux, I believe. Was it the French
It's
abbot?
interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because Virgil was a pagan, right? So he's not allowed in heaven exactly, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean that's just Catholic theology for you, especially at the time. And so Dante is guided by Virgil, and I think it's like a perfect metaphor, like going through like the steps of depression. Sometimes you have a guide who can help you, but he can only take you so far, and then you kind of need to reach the next level. And of course, the person who takes him up to God is Beatrice finally. And it's just interesting to kind of go through those steps, you know what I mean? Uh, from a literary perspective. One of the pagans that I find the most fascinating is he meets Ulysses. And Hell or Inferno is interestingly divided. Like if you are a good pagan, you're kind of in like these Elysian fields, right? So it's kind of like the Inferno. You suffer, you don't get to purgatory, and you don't get up to the heavens until Jesus comes around. So basically, nobody is allowed to purgatory even until Jesus comes around in Dante's cosmology. But so if you were a good pagan, I think even I don't know. I think he had like a certain level of respect for Saladin. So Saladin's kind of like in this pleasant part there.
He also spoke about Justinian as well, if
Justinian was, I believe, in heaven.
yeah,
He's like, yeah,
interestingly,
yeah,
although I think we even kind of mentioned that on the Justinian podcast that
yeah.
he was chosen for that. In reality, maybe not the best guy personally, but he was seen as
I think, yeah, maybe
hero.
at that time period, like that's kind of what they saw of Justinian. He was just this great emperor. And
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
we don't even know if he had like access to the secret history and everything. But yeah, I mean, he meets a lot of fascinating people like Aquinas and, other saints, that would be in heaven.
Aquinas, yeah. No,
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people say that Dante's like poetry is the poeticization of St. Thomas Aquinas's theology. Another literary
interesting. Yeah.
reference. But you know what? One of my favorite people he interacts with is he meets Ulysses, who's Odysseus in like Greek, Odysseus, right? Ulysses, and Ulysses actually talks to him, and because we kind of get the story like what happens after the Homeric epic, because the idea is Ulysses sails past the Pillars of Hercules, right?
Hmm.
And he sails past the pillars of Hercules, and he reaches the antipodes. Like the idea is he reaches the South Pacific and he goes to the island of Purgatory and dies because again he's pagan, so therefore Jesus hadn't been born yet. Oh, I mean, based on the idea that Ulysses lived like 1,000 years or so before Jesus. And he kind of had like this Promethean like impulse and drive to like defy the divine order, and it's similar to that Ulysses Alfred Lord Tennyson poem, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield, to sail, to the undying stars. So, Odysseus is trying, Ulysses is trying to go to like the border of the known world, the same way that Dante is. And it's interesting, like depression could feel like a dark forest, like we said in the beginning, right? And sometimes when you're depressed, you could strive to overthink, right? You're just like overthinking,
Absolutely.
trying to
Yeah.
solve everything. And I think it's interesting because Ulysses and Dante are very parallel in their journey, and it just gives like different examples for how you can deal with that spiritual and symbolic journey. So it's an interesting takeaway just of someone he interesting that he meets in his journey in the Inferno.
Because they're both explorers ultimately, right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Odysseus is the explorer of the seas, and
And the idea is Odysseus is the first mortal to make it to purgatory. Of course, he's not allowed there, and he's trying to defy divine order of God and everything.
hmm, yeah,
But Dante is the second mortal to make it there. Of course, they made it different ways. Odysseus sailed there, and Dante, crawled through the center of the earth, so to speak, and then up to the other side. But It's just fascinating to think about. This is kind of random, but I went on ChatGPT and I calculated, I said, let's say Satan was a star and he fell down into the earth in Italy, where would he show up? And apparently it's just some random place. I thought it might be an island or something, but it's not. The antipode of like anywhere in Italy is basically water in the South Pacific.
Hmm. Yeah.
And then I was trying to calculate, well, what would have been the velocity of a star falling down to be in the center of the Earth to create an impact of a mountain to come out the other side? It was just funny doing some mathematics for fun, but um, he had a very interesting
Yeah.
conception, not only literary, but I guess of the physical world itself.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I did like how he brought in all these pre-Christian pagan quasi kind of mythological figures into his poem. He's kind of like incorporating the mythology of his ancient ancestors in a way, Virgil and the likes, which was pretty cool, like because you think about medieval Europeans in some ways rejecting, um, the ancient classical era, but this was actually in some ways the beginning of almost like pre-Renaissance, his work and like that of Petrarch
Yes.
and Boccaccio, that kind of helped fuel the early proto Renaissance with this emphasis on classical, themes and motifs and
I
literary
mean,
influence on.
I wonder if it could ever be proven, but I think there's this idea that after the fall of Constantinople in 1204, not 1453, but 1204, there was this huge influx into the Latin world of Greek antiquity and thought, and it sort of rejuvenated them. So I wonder if this is like an aspect of that, because there must have been a lot of cross-cultural exchange from like the 80, 90 years Dante's life being after 1204 into Florence and Italy in general.
That's an interesting point, actually. I didn't think about that. Yeah, it's possible.
Um, and I mean, certainly this was like published in like early 1300s, right? I wonder if the Byzantine,
Yeah, he
like,
died in like 1321, I think. So, yeah.
so in theory, there could have been some overlap, right?
Yeah, in theory.
Yeah.
But yeah, as you said, Aquinas was also an influential figure of the time, and he adopted elements of what Aristotelian thought to
Yes.
work.
I mean, you bring up an interesting point. Like there's sort of an unanswered question in history. I mean, and going back to depression, I mean, you could say like the Dark Ages in some sense. I mean, of course, there's Boetius and like Saint Francis and everything, but and other saints. But it was kind of like a dark era, a depression era, so to speak. What was it that got Europe out of that era? What caused the Renaissance? I mean, there isn't like a clear answer.
Yeah,
Right?
well, there isn't. There's no clear reason for the fall of Rome. It's a complex, multifaceted problem, and I think there are a lot of different currents and trends that all kind of came together to make the Renaissance happen. But yeah, I guess suppose this era was like some of the earliest sort of inklings of it, and it would emerge more fully in the late 1300s or early 1400s. Petrarch himself said that like, he still felt like he was kind of living in a dark age. He acknowledged that. So yeah, I mean, obviously the Crusades, they played a big role, like the retrieval of various lost, translated ancient Greco-Roman texts, back into the medieval Christian world was definitely a factor. Yes, the stuff that happened in Byzantium and uh, I suppose, like, I don't know, in a way, the sort of fractious nature of the Italian city-states, that kind of disunity, it may have actually facilitated some of this in a weird way, like that all that competition, that social ferment, like, and it kind of caused a lot of literary experimentation and a lot of production of new works that were kind of based on earlier classical works, and yeah, I don't really have an easy answer, but
No, I don't think anyone does. I mean, it's one of the his like yeah, I mean, I agree with you. There was probably like competition, Florence is competing with, Venice in some respects, and then there's probably even competition, like you said, amongst these families and factions within, and obviously they're living in like cities, and Rome is nearby where you can see all these ruins. So I mean, it must have like created wonder. You'd like imagine just going there, even if you were sort of an uneducated peasant, like, whoa, who used to live here? Like these are the ruins of like a magnificent culture in a way. So that must have been part of it. I'm sure like the cultural exchange of the Crusades and like bringing back antiquity and ideas and things like promoted commerce and literary studies. And I mean, of course, they were Christian, right? So they're kind of looking into the history of Christianity, seeing that the Bible was written, at least the New Testament, in Greek originally, and seeing, well, if we can read Greek, basically we can read like Aristotle and all them, and Plato. So it's interesting to kind of, go through there but I mean, Dante, I mean, he's like a fascinating cosmology, and I mean, he's kind of the center of the Western canon in some sense. And if you value
oh
in
yeah,
the sense of
yeah.
aesthetics, um, and I mean, you have like all these different circles of hell, and each one kind of represents like one of the main sins. Um, and it's interesting because some people I know that the introduction to this book that I have here, it asks like the first page is like, do you think Dante missed a sin? Um, and I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question. Who knows? Because the problem is like you could argue different things.
Yeah,
And
that is subjective, but that's what makes it interesting, I guess, right?
oh yeah, 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 for sure, for sure. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think he inverts a lot of what people would expect. Like what the center of hell is actually the coldest part of hell. Um,
Right, exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
Because that part is the part that is most distant from God and his
Hmm.
well,
Yeah.
right, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a lot of it has to do with the idea of free will, and I mean that's a theological question, like Calvin sort of believed, of course, centuries later, and predestination and things like that. Um, and I mean nowadays there's like this Orthodox scholar. I don't know if he's a theologian, but he's David Bentley Hart at Yale University. I found out about him by reading a Harold Bloom book of all places, but he thinks he wrote this book that all shall be saved is the title. That if you look at the original writings of like early church and just the Bible text itself, there is no idea for permanent damnation. That's just a
Hmm.
very later idea in Christianity. So the idea is like what these people are arguing is that I guess you wouldn't be in the Inferno forever, like because no matter what your
Oh,
sins are, they don't. No matter what your temporary sins are, you shouldn't be in damnation forever.
interesting. Yeah, I
Yeah,
didn't know about that. I know that well, like the Catholic Church in particular holds purgatory to be more of a thing in contrast
right,
to say like the Orthodox Church. Um,
right, right.
and yeah, yeah, the way I was taught was that hell is pretty eternal, it's
Yeah,
permanent.
I
But
mean, I think that, and I may be mistaken, but I think that is still sort of Catholic teaching. I mean, like I said, I think the Orthodox thing is more like you may be there for a while, but it won't be forever because there's no way that eternal damnation could account for any temporary sin created on earth. But
well, that
I mean,
sounds
these.
like a better deal to me.
Yeah, well,
The
I mean,
Jews too, also they don't even really believe in a hell per se.
yeah, I'm less familiar with like modern like Jewish theology, but I think if you look at, yeah, I mean, the idea is in the Old Testament. I don't know if you could produce that idea as well for eternal damnation, but I mean, it's interesting, man. I mean, it's fascinating, who you meet in the Inferno. It's fascinating to connect it with theological questions, and I think like what the central theme could be of the entire Inferno and the ascent into purgatory and up into the heavens in Paradiso is like if you are depressed, I guess the idea is I don't know. I mean, I guess Dante just like embedded himself in Virgil basically and just rereading or doing a deep reading of Virgil, and then somehow he I guess is adopted or directed by Virgil. And because there's also a question, I mean, when I was younger, I was in the seminar and people were asking, well, did this really happen? Like, did Dante actually do this metaphysical journey? I mean, I guess if you're religiously inclined and literary inclined and open to that, then I guess it's possible. But I think another explanation is like he was just going through this major stuff, like you described from the historical perspective and of everything. Like the two factions, I forgot what they both start with a G, right?
Yeah, the Guelphs and Ghibellines, yeah.
Yeah, and if you're dealing with all that, then you kind of um it's fascinating to see how he builds himself up and self mobilizes and just builds up. Again, this isn't like an original idea. Maybe a lot of what we said is an original to us. I mean,
No, no, it's really not.
yeah, I mean, it was just like through our research and experience. But the thing is, what's interesting about Dante's Inferno is like, man, if you look at a summary online, if you go on Wikipedia, there are so many people. I mean, you need like an encyclopedic knowledge to figure out who all these people are in this really short little book, just in the Inferno. Like, who's this Pope? Who's Abraham? Who's like these Crusader guys nobody's ever Cornelius Africanus or whatever.
Hmm.
You know, who's this guy? Who's Averroes? You know, who are the Greek philosophers? And maybe you know them like through accumulation of your life, but I mean, it's tough. I mean, right? Just to keep on track of, and I think that's kind of rewarding in a way. It's like, oh, I look know all these tidbits here and there.
Yeah, a lot of names, man, a lot of references. But you got to wonder who was he writing to? Obviously, the educated elite, but like, would they have known all of these references? Was this common knowledge in the way that like, we have famous people from our own time, heroes, and and even superheroes in
Yeah.
the mythological ones.
Well, what's interesting about it is it's not dedicated to anyone. My opinion is, and I guess this isn't really substantiated, is that he wrote it for himself first and foremost, and then it became something
Right, right.
magnificent. I mean, I think he was known to be pretty poetic and had written poetry beforehand. And I mean, he has lovely poems about Beatrice and loving her and the pangs of like the inability of being with her. But um, he he's a he's a guy. I mean, who deals with a lot of art. Lived in this fascinating time, like you said, it was kind of a transitory period. Um, yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. He's like combining all of known knowledge together. So I
Right. It's a
don't know if like
compendium of sort in a way.
yes, yeah, because I wonder if it would almost be interesting to list the people he didn't mention. You know what I mean? We're all, you know what I mean? We're because he meets all the famous philosophers, he meets the famous Romans, the warriors, the crusaders, the popes, the emperors of different stages in the journey. But who doesn't he mention? That would be an interesting list too.
Yeah, that's a good point. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I guess if he was presenting this to like a lord or a noble or something, then he'd probably be there or somebody would be there to explain things, right? Like a
Right.
scribe or
He may have actually played up some otherwise more obscure figures because maybe he had to earn their patronage and stuff too. I don't know. He did kind of move around from city to city later in his life throughout Italy and stuff.
and I don't think that was necessarily what he wanted to do. I think he wanted to be in
Yeah.
Florence, and that I mean I think that also speaks to his depression as well, is that
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, do you think overall though, like this helped him overcome in some sense the supposed depression? Do you think it gave him a sense of hope that even though you crawl through all the pits of hell and the trials of purgatory, you come out, into a paradise of sorts?
I mean I think a really reasonable way to read it. I think like if you look at Dante's biography, I think I mean, and it's hard to pathologize and do all this stuff and like diagnose. And of course, we're not like clinicians, but I mean, it does seem like he had, what we would call like clinical depression. I mean, he went through a really rough time, and and he was just very sad, and in this you use the word despair. I think it's fair to say he was in a lot of despair. And I guess, I mean, you and I have talked a lot about self-help. I mean, that's a different topic, right? Even working on articles and things like that in that nature. But I
Maybe
mean,
a
the
little
idea
bit, a
is
little bit.
a little bit, yeah. I mean, and we've talked about it for years as well. Kind of how to, get out of the dumps or whatever you'd call it, like whether it's a short spell of depression or long, like you kind of need to do something. I mean, I think that if you come to a common denominator in like all self-help books, it's like you can't just like sit there. You got to do something.
Right.
And I think that's what Dante's doing here. He's doing it literarily by writing it, and then he's doing it like in the sense of like he's traveling in his mind, I guess, and like trying to move.
Yeah, and
Uh,
he did actually move around a lot too in real life.
yeah,
So he was, he was out there doing his thing. He wasn't like stagnant, He wasn't just like this isn't some edgelord, like
right.
lamentation or complaint about the state of things. He was actually trying to come to terms with his situation in a very impressive literary way that ended up becoming one of the cornerstones of European, Western canon. Sorry, we're getting a call from some friends. Anyway, um, yeah. So
I mean,
ended up working out.
it's interesting because yeah, I mean, he's the central. I mean, like you said, yeah, I mean, on par with like Shakespeare and James Joyce and these other, like we mentioned Greek tragedians and playwrights. I mean, there's so much to take out of this, and I guess the idea is like if you embed yourself in this, which is what we've been trying to do recently, right? Trying to figure out, and we're not by no means experts, but we've tried to engage with this text and the story. And we've also been enchanted, I think it's fair to say for you too, right? By the Italian, just the language of,
Yeah, the old Italian is actually very impressive from a literary point of view. He was among the earliest to actually use the vernacular Tuscan dialect, as we all know. And that actually, in no small part, thanks to him, became and other Florentines became the basis for what we call standard Italian uh, today, because there was no standard Italian language at the time. It was a series of dialects and languages and sort of a linguistic continuum. Tuscan eventually, much later, served as the basis for this language. Because of
it's.
the monumental, impact of these writers.
I mean, I've heard that Dante's perception is that he would have thought he was speaking Latin. I mean, do you agree with that linguistically?
That's an interesting. I don't know, but he had to have obviously known there's a difference between because he read actual Latin as every educated person did back then. But maybe he just saw Italian as like just an evolution or maybe corrupted form of Latin, which technically it is. Um, but no, that's an interesting question. I don't know. I haven't
It's
thought about
interesting
it.
linguistically, yeah. I mean, because you could say that about a lot of languages. I mean, like modern Greek is not ancient Greek, but obviously there's a lot of similarities, and you could say,
Yeah, it's interesting that we just say Greek is Greek. It's still Greek, but when we talk about Romance languages, we talk about Italian,
yes.
Spanish, French, Portuguese, Romanian, Catalan, but we don't talk about like modern Latin. It's
Oh yeah, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah. I mean, maybe it's because there's so many. Yeah, split. I mean, Greek basically just went into modern Greek with like very.
basically. I mean, there's like Pontic and Taconian, but other than that, there's not really.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe if history had turned out differently, maybe the
Right. Yeah.
languages would have evolved differently. I mean, but it's interesting that we bring up this distinction between Romance and Greek. English itself is like half Romance, half Germanic in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. You could say
Uh,
that. I mean, the
yeah,
basis is basically Germanic, like the structure and the basic core vocabulary, but it has a lot of romance like dressing on it, so to speak, from its history.
From like the Norman invasion and everything. And
Yeah, as well as intentional borrowing by scholars in the Middle Ages, which most European countries did to some extent. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because in English you often have two words for like sort of the same thing, like even in law, assault and battery. They're, I mean, depending where you are, I mean, it's kind of the same thing. And then but also like in a non-legal sense, like Holy Spirit, Holy Ghost, like ghost is an
Yeah.
English
Yeah,
accent
exactly.
word,
Exactly.
and then spirit is this Latin word. And I think you get a different sense. Like what's a ghost? A ghost is like a ghoul, and a spirit is like this beautiful light thing, right?
Yeah, it's interesting how the connotations of different words evolve over time and um certain words like the native English ones feel more like, I don't know, closer to home and more less lofty and scholarly, I guess, than their Latin counterparts. So word choice, does make a difference. We are getting a bit off track from the Dante thing, but his choice of language and wording and that he chose the vernacular, although it was a polished form of that vernacular, was an important choice, and it evoked a lot of emotion and pathos and like and I think he knew what he was doing when he made that choice. You know?
Yeah, and I mean, maybe he had no other option, right? I mean, if he was truly lost in a dark wood, either symbolically or literally, I mean, sometimes you just have to, yeah, uh, it's magnificent. He sailed past the pillars of Hercules in a metaphoric perspective, but like Odysseus did in the sense of like actually sailing past the Straits of Gibraltar. But um, do you have any? We're kind of getting close on time. Do you have any?
Yeah, we are. Nah, I guess it's an interesting take on this topic, and I guess a lot of people that might be struggling with these things today might not know or think about this work in terms of that struggle. They think of it as some like dusty old tome from like almost 1,000 years ago, or or just some lofty, inaccessible work. But they should give it a chance and maybe see what it can do for them. It can be pretty inspiring and at the very least interesting.
Yeah, and maybe get your mind off things if you got to figure out an encyclopedic, detail and spider web of all these different connections. Um, yeah, I mean, Dante's, yeah, I mean, if one is depressed, I think that, I mean, if the human experience is universal, then if what Dante experienced, no, not 1,000, but, a couple hundred years ago, um, could arguably be experienced by people today. And I mean, it's interesting to read about what people went through and how they reacted to that. So I mean, like Dante, we all have a journey to make, and sometimes we have to go through the layers of hell and experience other terrible things. And sometimes you have to encounter Satan and all these crazy people and uh, crawl out to the other side. And hopefully we can get some help to get up to heaven. And I guess that would hopefully equate with happiness, right?
It's the idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, depression, anxiety, and Dante's Inferno.
All right. Well, thanks, and join us next time for whatever we come up with.
Alrighty. Thank you. Bye bye.
All right. Bye.
Dante canto un Inferno nel mezzo di cammini di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura. Ah, che la diritta via è smarrita e quanto a dir qual era cosa dura este selva selvagge, aspra forte
che nel pensiero rinnova la pura tanta il mare, che poco e poi morte, mar trattare del bene, e ben ci trovai, diro dell'arte cose di chi vi ciorte, lo non sien ben retenir, com i vintrai, la tanta erpien sono che il punto, che la verace via abbondanai, ma pocio la fuie pie un coie giunotto, laddove terminiva che vaia che mave du pura il cor compunto, quande in alto vide sue spalle vestia ragia di piantia che mena diritto altre per un caie. Allor fu la parna un poco queta che nel lago del cor m'era durata, e notte che piasso con tanta pietà, e come chi con la fanta uscito fur del pelago la riva, si volge al squal per il gossa e guanto, così la mano il mio c'ha navar fuggivia, si volse a retro a rimar, lo passo con la siogia me persona via, poche posato un poco il corpo lasso, ripresa la verbeagia deserita, siccome le peta ferme sempre era le il passo, ed ecco quasi al comuniziare della erta una lonza leggeria, e presta al molto, che il de piel malco era coverta, e non mi spiare parta dianzi a volto, anzi impenvinda al tanto mio cammino, ci fui per ritronar, poi fi volte volto. Era dal principio del mattino, e il sol montava su con quella stella che ran con lì quando all'amore divino. Mosse di prima queste cose bella, si c'alla bene, sperar m'era coaginone. Di quella fiera la ghetta pieia, la ora del tempo e la dolce stagione, ma non sì che paura non mi desse la vista che m'approve d'un un leon.